Alright, well this time let's start out with a little traditional media sketch. This is just a little pen sketch on a piece of white paper, and I'm going to select the background off of it. And this demo, it's going to be about 45 minutes, and you'll see it follow the same sort of similar steps as the previous tutorials. Drop in a background first. I selected my drawing, deleted the white background, then I darkened its value, and that's usually how I start. This one's going to be much more painterly and illustrative as opposed to the car, which was much tighter using paths everywhere. We'll use a few paths probably towards the end just to clean up some edges. But one of the fastest ways to start these is just create your silhouette, one layer, as you can see on the right, and then put another layer. Actually, I don't even have another layer. I have a layer above, but I'm not painting on it. Right now I'm just using a multiply brush, and I started out at the beginning with a color dodge brush. The color dodge was set to white, and that was just pulling up some light areas. And then I have multiply. You see it there set to like 50% opacity with an airbrush. And that's how I set up really quickly all of my base values and all the form transitions just to get a light side, a number 2 side, and a shadow side. Then one of my favorite brushes to use is just like a big ellipse with a hard edge. And you'll see I'm doing all my painting on a clipping path layer above the base layer. The base layer, all it does is set up my base values, my lights, my darks, and the silhouette. And then I put a clipping path layer above it. And again, if you hold down the Alt or Option key on a Mac, as your cursor slides over the dividing line between those two layers, you'll get a little hand icon. Just click it when you have the hand icon, and it will make a clipping path layer, and that only allows me to add value, or effectively just think of it, I can only paint where I already have pixels on the layer below. So what that means is my silhouette stays consistent, and all I'm doing is sculpting form. Right? It's really simple. We're not even worrying about perspective yet. It's basically just making things go bump. And this ellipse has pressure sensitivity turned up, both for flow and transfer. Those are both turned up all the way, and then you can do that underneath your brush settings. And you'll see it makes for kind of a rough, you get rough gradations, but I don't even mind so much. It's really just, I'm trying to block in and discover the forms. So all I'm doing is light side, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadows, all the same things we've done throughout the entire book when it comes to value and form rendering. And this video has been sped up, I would say about 400% on average throughout. So if this was a 45-minute, this entire rendering was probably about 3 hours, sped up to 45 minutes, just so you can get a gauge of the speed. I wish I could paint that fast, render that fast, but nope. But it gets a little boring if we watch the real time. And you don't learn that much more, because you can just see it's one brush, one layer, and all I'm doing, and you'll see it, the eyedropper pops up. It's because I have a button on my pen, again set to Option, and I just start picking the values from within the rendering, and I don't have to have my swatches pop up, nothing. I can just sort of sit and start to render. And this for me is one of the most fun things to do, is render form just in grayscale, right? Just working on the value changes and trying to apply the fundamentals of everything that we've covered so far in the book. So light and shadow, cast shadows are a critical part, as well as occlusion shadows, to making things look three-dimensional and getting your overlaps working. So my light in this case is from the upper left, maybe not quite at a 45, maybe 30-degree angle from vertical. And you can see it's a strong direct light because I'm putting in some strong hard edge cast shadows. And you have to really you need to design those cast shadow shapes quite a bit because they can become graphically very strong. So be aware of those, and if the graphic shape of the shadows is becoming too distracting, then switch your light source to a softer edged light source, and make all your cast shadows soft. And that will minimize the graphic nature of the shadows. But if you have a hard light source, like if it's outdoor sunlight, for instance, on a clear day, those shadows are really what help tell the story of the type of light. So they're very interconnected. And you can see I had a ragged edge on my silhouette, and that's because I just used the magic wand to select my line drawing off of my background. You'll also notice that the line drawing over on the right hand side is still there floating on top. Should I ever lose my line drawing, I can just turn that back on, have it set to multiply if I want to refer back to the original design sketch. I've also flattened down my clipping path layer, so you can see over there the blue highlighted layer is just now all the value, the line drawing, everything is on one layer, and all I'm doing is erasing with a hard edge eraser, just cleaning up the silhouette by hand. Now this is sort of the rough discovery phase still of doing a big rendering. Here I'm adding a little bit of perspective, so when we see those things are a bit circular in cross section. So if our vanishing point is somewhere near the mid torso of this shape, we could see a little bit of the front of each of those segments. And this noodling is I've already started kind of noodling in some details here. This can take a while, especially if I was to get all of those symmetrical. I would probably just render one of them and cut and paste it and then just warp it to create the shape change. But in this case, I'm just doing it all freehand. And this again is much more like sort of like marker rendering. Like if I had some Copic markers, this is the same sort of way I would go, except I couldn't use white as easily. So I'd have to think ahead a little bit more. Working inside, in this case, Photoshop or something like Sketchbook Pro or Painter, you can just sit and use white, just as opaque as black. So it's kind of a much simpler medium, I think. Digital rendering is much easier. You also have Command Z. You also have layers. But the same things, and you could do it, of course, with marker. You could use white. You just use like a white colored pencil. Or you could be doing the same sort of thing with acrylic paint. And just pushing and pulling on surfaces using the light and the shadow. And when you really get the values dialed in and working, and there's a little reflected light coming off those lit surfaces, so it's bouncing off the leg and this little fin sticking out and bouncing up and illuminating those areas that are rolling under. And remember, don't let that reflected light look like it's too strong. Don't make it as strong as the primary light source. That's pretty strong there, but still works. Still looks like it's in cast shadow. I'll probably knock it down a little bit more. So this is really an exercise in, making things go bump, basically. And when you get it really dialed in, as I was starting to say, it really starts to feel like you're sculpting with clay. So if you're a sculptor and you have some background in sculpting, and you get your values just right, and you get all your tools, you get your Wacom tablet, whatever you might be using, your markers and pencil, you get that just dialed in right, and you get enough control, you can start to feel like you're sculpting. And that's when it becomes the most fun for me, is when it feels like clay. Because I used to sculpt a lot in clay, in automotive clay, and this kind of, for me, feels the same. It's kind of pushing and pulling and sort of infinite variation, and you can just get smaller and smaller with your radii and fillets and blending surfaces together. You can see I just started to add a little bit of symmetry there for the far side leg. I don't know if that's where it's going to stay, but just to give me a sense that there's a little depth to this. It's actually the same exact steps that Neville Page was doing back, I can't remember what page his dinosaur was on. But it's the same sort of thing. I'm just using digital tools, and in that case he was using all pencil. And cleaning up my silhouette again. See, this is why I sped up this video, because to see something this detailed at real time gets to be a bit tedious. Not a lot changes, to be honest, from now to the end. It's just this same sort of thing. It's cleaning up silhouette. Once I have the silhouette cleaned up, I'll either hit preserve transparency to come back and render the form, or I'll put on a clipping path layer, one or the other. But for this demo for the book, I wanted to do something that had a lot of complexity, that was a bit abstract. That was not a car, wasn't an airplane, wasn't, a building or a teapot or something like that. I wanted to do something that was organic, yet mechanical, and had a lot of variety of forms and a lot of details, just so you can see that the same rendering technique is basically applied over and over and over again. All you're doing is changing the silhouette and the fullness or flatness of surfaces. Adding, I'm taking my best guess, obviously, at the cast shadows. I'm not calculating anything, so it really is a guess. But what's fun is you can really start to bring form to something and bring life to it without even having to really worry about perspective. You just start to push and pull and sculpt the form. To be honest, this is about as complex as renderings get for the sort of things that I do, whether it be vehicles or products or environments or characters, especially for the entertainment world. You can go, at a certain point, it just becomes a function of time, and how tight a value rendering gets is really dependent on how much time you're given to finish that rendering. And most of the time, it can stay quite sketchy and still communicate the idea. Like, we could see the idea of this even from our little pen sketch. And then we could also see the idea just with that first block in of the color dodging and material, the multiply layer or multiply brush, that I was using. In the first 10 minutes, you get the idea across, but there's no subtlety to the forms. There's no detailing, and you sort of work through a hierarchy of what is important when. Meaning, if I want to communicate big, gross silhouette, I could just do this whole thing with, a black Sharpie marker on a piece of white paper. If I then want to start to add a couple more details, I might have to grab a different pen or start with gray Copic markers, for instance. And usually what I do is you give yourself an amount of time that matches the medium that you're using. So what I mean by that is if I'm doing a marker sketch or a Sharpie, for instance, I know I don't have a lot of time. So I sort of bang it out really fast, get the big silhouette done. Then if I have time, I might scan that and start to add the surfacing and details at this level. In this case, I knew I was going for a much more finished rendering. I still wanted to sort of do it all painterly and almost all by hand. Here's a path I'm using to clean up that edge. You'll see it's going to be a lot faster than trying to paint out that edge. I just made a shape, hit the third button from the left on the path menu, and that created a selection, and then I just hit delete. Here I'm mirroring the leg to the far side, and I'm just going to darken it down by changing the levels. And now adjusting the base layer, erasing a little bit, so we have a mirror image of that leg on the far side. So saying that they're basically the same. And I just posed it a little bit. Again, the perspective is very loose, but you get the idea. We'll tighten up the perspective as it gets a little bit more finished. So even though this is all done, just with minimal paths to help clean up the silhouettes, it's kind of one of my favorite ways to work is to freehand everything on the interior. Unless you'll see at the very, very end, we'll add a couple of circular details. Those are tough to freehand. Of course, you can use a hard edge circular brush, which makes it easier to do. But I tend to use this hard-edged ellipse when I'm doing a lot of form exploration. And the reason for that is that, yes, the big gradations look a little bit scruffy, but I know I'm probably going to come back and re-render everything in a cleanup pass. So when I'm discovering form through the application of value, I like to have that ability to put in a hard edge and a gradation. And that's where this ellipse brush kind of does both, because I have it's very pressure sensitive, meaning you don't have to push, you have to do multiple strokes to build up the value. You won't get 100% opaque in one stroke. So because it's hard to build up the value, that means it builds up slowly, and you can start to build up layers almost like you're using an acrylic brush and acrylic paint, glazing over an area multiple times to add more and more value change. You sort of have to do the same with this hard edge brush. And I don't mind that. It kind of adds a nice patina to the surface. Those little, the marks that you make with that brush kind of give it a nice hand done feel. And again, all my lighting here is I'm essentially taking my best guess at it. So again, upper left. So I know the left side of this leg, which is kind of like a big cone, the left side is going to be in light, the right side is going to be in shadow. And anywhere that there's a surface that's more perpendicular to the light source, like that little hook right down at the bottom there, where that surface turns back, that's going to be brighter. And that's the basic rule from observing all those geoforms early in the book. And in my mind, that's what I'm thinking about. This is kind of like a cone. This is kind of like a sphere. This is kind of like a cylinder. Another part might be is flat and planar. And so I always think back to those as my guide to help figure out these forms kind of on the fly. And then, to be honest, at the end of the day, when you're trying to communicate a surface, that you just need to turn it with a value. So if you want to make a little form read, by all means, take a little artistic license. You have to be a little bit careful, because it means, if you take too much artistic license, you might not be able to build that surface in a 3D model. But usually these renderings are not meant to be the end all, right? You're making discoveries here in 2D, which then as you start to model in 3D, you'll also make discoveries. So this is just a general guide to get that surfacing started and get that modeling step started, even if you're doing a digital model or you're really going to go sculpt this in clay. You're sort of just taking your best guess, and it will be very helpful, especially if you're handing this off to a modeler. The more true you are, meaning not cheating, not so much artistic license on how you add your values and multiple light sources and things, the easier it will be for somebody else to model. Now they're going to make discoveries. They're going to learn everywhere that you cheated as soon as you start to ask somebody else to model your forms. So, keep it in mind. And each sort of experience is different. Or you're working with a team, or you're working with a group of modelers, or you're just going to go do it by yourself. And again, when I render things, I'm always thinking about building a model. Almost always. Tend to not illustrate for illustrative purposes that often. I'm really thinking much more about communication of the design. And you see that little area right there that I'm working. I just changed the form. I'm actually getting a little overlap. There's kind of maybe like a little fin sticking out off that part of the leg. So I had that catch a little bit more light and then overlap that little flange that went behind it. So maybe these are pointing out at a 45-degree angle towards us. So we see a little bit of the front edge of the leg, and we're not going to see any of the back except for the silhouette. Don't like it, so just paint it out. Don't be afraid to make those big changes. Those are important. I'm adding a bit of reflected light from the ground plane. And it's also the nice thing about rendering these things, sort of loosely and painterly, is you won't feel bad about making those big changes. You just have to get it right, so do whatever it takes. There I just made a path. I'm going to adjust the shape a little bit, and I'm going to use this to cut out my silhouette. So I made a selection, hit delete, and that cut out the back edge of the leg. And now I'm going to do the same for the front edge. Adjust it. And you notice, of course, that the interior values support the silhouette. So we have that little core shadow across the little, where it might be the knee area, right? I'll need to fine tune it a little bit, but the silhouette should look like it supports the value changes that are happening on the interior. And I just duplicated that leg, put it on its own layer, and that'll make it easy for us to drop it into the behind the front leg. And now I'm going to set my horizon line and my vanishing point. So I'm just using a line tool on a separate layer. I was trying to see where might the vanishing point be, so I was pulling sort of off my model back to where the VP might end up to try and discover if there was a natural VP for my line drawing sketch. And it kind of feels about right there. So now what I'm going to do is readjust my front leg. You notice I have an overall width or depth at the bottom for the near side feet where they touch the ground, and then the far side. It's a very shallow perspective, meaning I'm using a very long camera lens. See, there's not a lot of convergence. And then the nice thing about doing these sort of articulated machines is that because they're articulated, you can move the legs as they would pivot. So you can sort of cheat and see more of the far side legs than you would if they were exactly mirrored. If it was exactly mirrored, the front leg in the same pose, the near side to the back side, right, we would see just a little black line. We wouldn't really see much at all. So I tilted it. And this is a cheat that I just did for casting a shadow. It's totally inaccurate, but when it's so foreshortened, it gets you close enough. And then I'm just modifying a little bit. So again, my light upper left, more like just in this case of doing the shadow, kind of overhead and a little bit towards us. And now I'm filling in some of the gaps. Again, educated guess. Hard edge though, because remember the shadows on the shape itself are hard edged, so that means my cast shadow also should be hard edged. Yes, it's farther away from the object, so wherever it's casting a shadow from the top part of the shape, make that fuzzier, and then right up next to the legs, make it sharper, like we've seen in the observations earlier in the book. Thomas staged that really great photograph from earlier in the book of that stool next to the large lamp post in the parking lot with that little cube on top of it, and we could see all three of those shadow edges right next to each other. And I thought that was a great example of those edges becoming softer as they get further away from an object that's casting them. And now using an airbrush, now back to my hard edge brush. Didn't like those shapes. And you'll see it kind of went through a sort of top of the shape or the design. It started refining and worked my way down. And now I'm kind of doing a pass back up and revisiting areas that I don't like the shapes. Just like that little area. And that's totally subjective. That's just styling decision. And I try to get the shapes to flow back into each other. So if I have one flat, I've established a plane on one segment of a leg, then I want to continue that surface across the gap into the next piece. And that's just sort of the design language of this shape, or of this design. And you can see I don't zoom in that much. I tend to noodle it too much if you zoom in. So it's about as zoomed in as I think this rendering is going to get. We'll probably add a couple little details at the end, zoom in a little more. But I tend to work this way because I like to see all the surrounding values, meaning the background and other values that are nearby, so that I can keep the focus in the areas that are most important to me, and I don't overdo it in other areas. So that there's a little hole on that elbow there, and it's got a little inset that might, later if we made this color, that might be a little color detail. And you can see my rough vanishing point there. I was just really sketching in those perspective lines, and now I'm going to use them to try and transfer that elbow back over to the far side. So I'm saying that's the width change we're seeing there, right? Meaning the depth. That's how wide that is at the elbows. Now, it could be how wide it is, or the entire leg on the far side could just be moved back a little bit. So when you're doing these side views, if something that's articulated, could be a robot thing like this, a vehicle, could be a person, you can take a lot of artistic freedom with the positioning. You want them to always be the same length of joints and pivots on the far side, but you can articulate them because poses can be asymmetrical. And because they can be asymmetric, you can cheat quite a bit more and still get away with it. So that's what's happening there. You'll see that my pivot there for the front leg looks like it's probably set back a little too far. I don't know if I go back and tweak that a little bit or not. We'll have to wait and see. When I recorded this, I recorded all the picture first, so all the painting, and then came back a couple months after the book had gone to press, and now I'm laying down the audio much later, so I don't remember exactly step for step the order or how finished it gets, to be honest. So we're giving you the play-by-play as I see it happen. Right, and you see there I just pulled a little faceted shape with that vent on that upper leg, and I did that by putting a little highlight across the top, just a little bit lighter than the side of the leg. Then the middle of that vent was the same value as the side of the leg because it's the same orientation to the light, and then I just put a little shadow area, kind of like a number 2 side because it's not casting a shadow, so that's still in the light but darker than the side, but not so dark as the cast shadow area above it. And it's just that subtle. Your brain is very, very sensitive to value change, meaning it's very sensitive to recognizing those value changes. So you don't have to make a large value change to have the form shift. So those can be quite subtle. Now, the rougher your image quality, let's say like if you're working on a really rough piece of paper or using very textural brushes, for instance, you're going to have to over-exaggerate the value changes because it's hard to see past all the texture. In this case, as I start to refine the shape, and now I'm kind of into the last 15 minutes of this rendering demo, and you'll see that I go back and start using airbrush and refining my values and the surfaces, and as that happens, the value shifts can be much smaller to still indicate the form. Where I was using earlier that big, elliptical brush with a hard edge, now you can communicate the same forms with less value change. And now I've got a layer here put on top, and I'm just painting white over the top to make a couple of those lit surfaces glow a little bit. So I'm experimenting here with adding what would be like a little bit of bloom, which is explained later in the book, towards the end of the book. And that would be, the light is so bright that it's sort of creating a fuzzy, glowing edge around my lit surfaces. All right, you can see now I've got a layer on top and it's set to multiply. It's still a clipping path layer, so it's going to follow the silhouette of the layer underneath. And now I'm just making fine adjustments to bring the focus back up towards the top of the body. The leg areas were getting a little bit too hot or too bright. And so I put down a multiply layer on top, used a soft airbrush, and just knocked down some of the areas that I thought were a bit too contrasty, had too much contrast. And so then I came back and I erased back out of it to pull back up a little selective couple of highlights. And now I've got a layer on top set to normal, and you'll see I'm using an airbrush again. So now I've got a soft edged round airbrush, and now I'm fine tuning. So now that I've kind of done the entire pass top to bottom, worked out kind of a form language of this soft faceted form that runs around all the joint areas, pushed and pulled on some surfaces to the point where I generally like it. Now this is my second pass. So go back up to the top. Now start hitting everything with a softer airbrush. Okay, and now the refinement starts. The first one was just the rough pass. So now I'm putting in a core shadow there, and you'll see the core shadow tapers a little wider up where the radius is larger, up towards that point or nose. I always think this thing's kind of, the left side is kind of its head here, left side of the image. Then you see that the core shadow tapers, just like that's part of a cone. And then it casts a little shadow, and then we have a little reflected light below that. Same down here. And remember, the reflected light is coming from a spot on that form, and the closer it is to that undercut in the shadows, the brighter the reflected light should be. And then as that reflected light source gets further away from that little undercut, it should fade. So now I'm adding all those little subtle changes. Softening that radius right there. Redefining that form. And again, this is back to, kind of feels like I'm sculpting. That cast shadow there is blocking the reflected light. So there's a little bit more of an occlusion shadow down in that little crevice. And I find a lot of times that when I see student work and even some professionals, that I think they stop too early on the value work. That there's so much more that they could do. They tend to really not try to, say accurately define the volumes, or whether or not it's just super accurate, it's explore the volumes. There I'm softening that little core shadow through there to make the radius a little bit larger. So I think there's a lot you can do with just value work and sculpting your forms to this level of finish. Yes, it takes time, but the surfaces become much more satisfying, I think. So there's a little on-off. You can see how rough the early one was. Yeah, it looks like I'm just going to do a little cleanup of the silhouette using a path. Selection. Actually, sorry, the white arrow. And grabbing the individual handles or nodes of my little points on that path. Moving them around. You'll see some cut in and some actually expand out. Now make it a selection. And right there, I'm going to fix the silhouette, add a little to it. And I just hid that for a moment, and then what I did was just delete out the rest. So that cleaned up the silhouette around the front. And now I'm trying to estimate the shape of the cast shadow from that form above. Again, this is a total guess on that flat plane sticking out, that kind of little flipper shape there. So now I'm kind of estimating what would the cast shadow do. Looks like it's going to cut a little bit more like that. So that was my version of a little quick construction. And I still want to see the forms back in the shadows. So I lighten up those a little bit so we can still see those cut lines. And by that cutting straight across, that tells me that the view of that little core shadow from above, from the shape above, is kind of straight across. And giving this guy here a little bit of thickness. And you can see it's kind of endless. These things, because these forms are quite complex. You could spend a lot of time. I mean, you could actually spend a couple of days or longer, especially if we start adding fasteners and then weathering and switch it over to color. Which if once you get a good grasp of the fundamentals, This is when the rendering starts to get really fun. For me, it's always, the more it feels like sculpting, the more enjoyable it becomes. And you can see that the forms become more attractive as they become more refined. Not only refined from a sculpting standpoint, but just refined from a value standpoint, that they just start to look more real. And as they start to look more real, a lot of times they start to look more attractive. And then you start to subtly blend areas together. You see I'm effectively repainting that entire surface, but I'm using all the values that I already established, because it was generally working, right? My light side, shadow side, reflected light was all basically working. And so that little surface right there is turning back up to the light. So there's kind of two faceted surfaces there, and then a top surface that catches more light. That would be more perpendicular to my light source. And drop in a couple cut lines. If you're really going more photoreal, this would be done much more like the car from the previous demonstration, where I start really doing all the cut lines and everything with pads. In this case, I'm going to do all that stuff freehand. The only thing I really used the pads for was to clean up my silhouette. So the silhouette's so much stronger than the interior part lines or cut lines. Notice that throughout all these value demonstrations, the value rendering demonstrations, I always work general to specific. And what I mean by that is the large shapes get rendered first, then the smaller shapes get rendered on top of those. And my layering strategy in this case has been quite minimal. I really put layers on top, make it a clipping path layer, and as soon as I like the design, then I flatten it back down to the main layer. So I'm using the layer ability of digital rendering to help me explore a little bit before I commit. But once I like it, then I will commit it down to the base layer. So it's almost, because it's all freehand, a bit, yes, big surfaces you want to use the layering as well, but since it's all kind of freehand painted, more like you would do traditional media, this is very much like traditional media, either working with pencil or markers and chalk and wax pencil, sort of light dark, pushing and pulling on surfaces by changing the values. Next up will be an even more organic shape on the next spread, which is will be a bunny rabbit that Chris Ayres designed and drew, and then I'm going to render it up. And then after that is the dinosaur, traditional media dinosaur rendering is actually in a few pages. Then there's some environmental demonstrations, and that will finish up this chapter. And then the rest of the book is dedicated to rendering reflective surfaces. But you really need to have a great handle on communicating your forms with values before you start to jump into color and materials. So that's why there's a variety of demonstrations at the end of this chapter. And it's putting everything together at this point. I mean, yes, it doesn't look like a geoform anymore, which is the point. But in my mind, I'm always thinking about the geoforms, and I'm thinking about the foundation and fundamentals from earlier in the book. And that's what gives all of these more complex surfaces realism, and allows me to paint them out of my head without looking at anything. And that's another part that becomes really fun, is that you can just start to experiment and discover forms just by playing with the value. And tweaking it. I didn't make this very tight through here, but you get the idea. Just keep refining. Again, if I was going to want to make that tighter, I would probably make one really pristine cut line, one pristine ribbed kind of element, and then I would just cut and paste and warp. I might even render all of those straight first and then come back and warp this panel so all the lines look very consistent. But if you want something that looks a little bit more handmade, in your design. Let's say that all these panels are very handmade and a little bit rough, maybe a little bit primitive. Then by painting them all as opposed to cutting and pasting one, will give it that handmade look. So I like both. There's really no right or wrong. It's just your personal preference. You want sort of a hand-done, handcrafted look versus a machined precision look. So we've got about 4 minutes left on this, it looks like. And you can see there's so much more that you can just keep tweaking and tweaking and noodling and adding little radii to ever smaller surfaces. You could zoom in more and more. You could start adding fasteners. It just goes on and on. So in this case, though, I think it's accomplished the goal, which is to try and show you an example of a rendered surface done from my imagination, applying all the fundamentals that we've explained so far. Now I've got all my elements there. I have a light side, right? I've got a decent 1, 2, 3 read. I've got cast shadows. I have occlusion shadows. I've got reflected light. I've got all the elements that make something look three-dimensional. And beyond that, it's just styling. And you can spend a lot of time doing styling. I hope you've been really making good use of these video tutorials and trying to do some of them yourself, and meaning not recording your own tutorial but doing all the exercises and go in and do renderings and follow along. And you can see with this book, you figured out, I'm sure by now, that a lot of the content is communicated via these tutorials. Obviously you get all the physics and the explanations from the text of the book, but we made a conscious decision to do a lot of these videos because to be honest, we'd run out of pages. If we tried to put this rendering, a 3-hour rendering might have 20 steps to try and illustrate what I'm doing here in the video, and if we did that, we'd just burn up all the pages. So in order to keep the book more affordable and not so repetitive, showing every single step in printed form, we tried to couple the most important demos. We tried to couple those through these videos. So in this case, video plus printed matter, we think, is the best way to communicate what we're doing. Okay, what I did right there was I just made a selection with the lasso tool on my base layer, and I did Command J, and that made a new layer via copy, and then I went to levels and I darkened down those elements. So what I'm doing now is I'm changing the local value of the surface. So if you think back to when earlier in the book you saw I think there was a cube, there's a white cube, a medium gray cube, and a dark gray cube, or almost black. That's what I'm doing here. I'm going in and I'm changing the local value of those elements. So those panels are now a super dark gray. Now I'm looking at my perspective here a little bit, and I want to put some circles on the side of this shape. So I'm taking a guess at what the degree of that ellipse would be. I'm using a hard edge round brush, and I'm just going to put a little pattern there of some vents. Right now, of course, they just look like black dots, which is fine. And then I'm just going to use a little bevel and emboss layer style, setting my light direction to the same as what I've rendered, and just playing around now with different modes, different, smooth, hard chisel, in, out. And so I wanted to just drop those like they were holes that had a little radius around them. And now I'm going to go back and render the interior of those. So there's like a little step, and then the light goes back inside. And so it should be the same value as the side body. So what that is a hole with another panel set deeper in that's just slightly darker than the side body of the mech. And that's basically it. So total time, I think that took me about 3 hours to render, sped up into about 45 minutes. Hope that helps. And let's move onward.